Hello, this is Tony Blazer, back with another video for the Motocross Vault on YouTube. And what I'm going to do in this one is cover the last installment of Inside Motocross. If you're not familiar with Inside Motocross, it was a magazine produced from 1992 to 1993 by Jim Hale and Fran Kuhn. Now, this magazine was hugely influential at the time. It's like coffee table size. You can see it's large format, beautiful glossy pictures inside, gorgeous photography. Really a very stark departure from what you would have found in most motocross magazines in the early 90s. As I said, it only made 4 issues. This is the last one. Some of that was due to pressure from inside the industry. Axo Sport was the main driving force behind this magazine, Jim Hale. And unfortunately, there was some inside politics within the industry about advertising revenue and such, and I think some people, namely Motocross Action, felt that Inside Motocross was competing directly with them, even though the magazine was very different. In truth, it really isn't direct competition for Motocross Action. Motocross Action was doing bike tests and other things, and Inside Motocross is really more like what resurgence is now. But in any case, Inside Motocross only made it these 4 issues. This 4th one here is probably my least favorite of the 4. All of them are excellent. This one is just maybe a little bit, maybe because it's the last one, it's kind of bittersweet, but it covers the departure of Damon Bradshaw, which was really a shocking revelation at the time. Damon had just signed a massive contract with Yamaha. He'd almost won the Supercross title the year before, just barely missing out. And 93 had been a bit of a tough year after taking the outdoors off to get his knee fixed. He had not done nearly as well and gotten beaten by Jeremy McGrath. And citing basically burnout, he walked away from his $1 million contract and left the sport. He would come back a couple years later, but Damon was never the same after this. This is, as I said, the last issue. I'm going to go through here just as I did in issues 1 through 3. I scanned the whole magazine. I'm going to go by page, go through all the articles, talk a little bit about what's in the magazine, what I thought about it at the time, and my feelings on it now. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you subscribe. As I said, you can find issues 1 through 3 in their entirety on my channel. I've also scanned them in a PDF form. If you go to the motocrossvault.com, you can actually download them, read them yourself, just as the magazine appeared originally. So, it was very painstaking. It took me many hours to do this, so I hope you enjoy it. Share it on social media, tell your friends, and help the channel out if you would. Subscribe, ding the little bell, I'd appreciate it. So here is the story of Inside Motocross issue 4. As we discussed earlier, Inside Motocross was a magazine that was published in 1993. There were 4 issues. It was published by Jim Hale of Axo Sport America fame. He had the idea of doing kind of a magazine that was more of a visual telling of motocross with personalities and kind of a look behind the scenes, but there were no bike tests or any of this traditional stuff you would have seen in Motocross Action or like Dirt Rider at the time. The editor was Fran Kuhn, also a kind of a well-known person in the industry at the time. Fran was a great photographer, had worked for several of the other magazines, and then he had enlisted people like Davey Coombs and Jack Bernicle, Luke Verbeek, some of the well-known writers and photographers of the time, and they all contributed to put out one of the most interesting and beautiful magazines of the 90s in the motocross industry for sure. Inside Motocross, like I said, only lasted 4 issues, but its legacy went on far longer than that. Later motocross magazines like Motocross Journal and the current Racer X, Meta, owe a lot of their inspiration to Inside Motocross. They kind of are similar in the way they look at the sport and also some of the content. Alright, in this one, we are going to look back at the issue page by page, just as I did in the previous 3 installments. If you haven't seen them, look at my feed. I did cover issues 1 through 3 in their entirety, and I also have posted on my website and at PulpMX the full issue so you can read it. So if you go to pulpmx.com, you can see them there, or if you go to the motocrossvault.wordpress.com, you can read the full PDF of the magazine, so you can kind of go along and use this kind of as a classic commentary. Here on the first inside cover we have a HP2 ad, which was Honda's in-house 2-stroke oil. I love this oil. It was definitely one of the ones I always used. The price was very reasonable. Had a cool blue color so you could tell if it was mixed into your gas.
And Honda certainly has a long-running power sports history here, and you can see it a little bit in their IndyCar here in the NSX, which was their supercar in the 90s, and of course the 93 Supercross champion Jeremy McGrath. All right, on the table of contents here, we get a look at what we're going to cover in this issue. This is probably my least favorite of the four issues, but it's still a great magazine. This one does have a great interview with Damon Bradshaw talking about his decision to retire. There's also an interview with Jeff Emig, who had just become the 1992 125 National Motocross Champion and helped lead America to victory in the Motocross Des Nations. There's also coverage of the Motocross Des Nations in '93. The last one we would win in a row. I think it went to 13 in a row before we lost in '94 to Great Britain. There's of course the great photography that's in all these issues, and some by design. In this by design, we actually cover the switch to inverted forks. It's a pretty interesting issue. Like I said, all things concerned, or all things considered, it's a great magazine, but maybe not my favorite of them. On the intro page here, we have a little blurb that Fran Kuhn always put on them. This one's talking about Damon Bradshaw and his decision to retire. Fran believes that Damon made the right decision. It's funny. He makes the point of how all of us, on the sidelines want to be a factory rider, or at least think we do. Certainly when we're younger, it seems glamorous, and you have money and fame, and being able to do what we all do for fun and pay to do. But with that comes a lot of pressure. A kid like Damon had been, pretty much raised in the sport and been making money for the family from a very early age. And with all that high dollar contracts come a lot of pressure. And I think it just got to him. And it's nice of Fran here to kind of stand behind him and say he made the right decision. And all of us who are maybe in his shoes might feel the same. Damon still gets, vilified somewhat by a lot of people for walking away from a multi-million-dollar contract in '93, but it's hard to say if he probably was doing the right thing to go out there and not perform and take money from people when your heart's not in it is difficult, and you have to admire somebody who's willing to say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you your money's worth, or I'm not going to do it. On page 6 and 7, we have an interesting conversation about the format for the Outdoor Nationals. This is something that still rages to this day. Every time they talk about changing the format for Supercross, I'm on the record of being a big proponent of the semi races, and I think taking them out was a mistake. Well, in the 90s, there was a debate about going to a single moto format, basically a Supercross style format for the Outdoor Nationals. In '93, they had run a trial of this idea at Glen Helen, which was promoted by Roger DeCoster at the time. They ran like heat races and then single motos that paid double points in the 125 and the 250 class. At the time, before they did this, all the promoters had voted to switch to this in, I guess, '94 would have been the first year for it. But then after it went off, half the promoters apparently decided had a change of heart, and the dissenting opinion was led by Dave Coombs, who is the current editor of Racer X's Davey Coombs' father. At the time, he was a promoter of, I think, two events, which would have been Steel City and High Point. And the feeling was among the dissenters that the same issue I think that happens in Supercross, and that when you're putting 16 guys into the main from the heat race, you're not going to get as intense of a battle, and a lot of the guys who aren't in the top 1, 2, or 3 are probably just going to cruise around and get that spot. Whereas in the two motos that pay fresh points, you're going to have double the chance of having a good battle. I actually tend to agree with this. The thought at the time, though, was that it would be a more TV-friendly package, which also has, a good point to it. But the TV package would be easier to sell if you had one moto in each class. But there is something to be said for traditional motocross as it is, and as we can see, almost 30 years later, we're still using the same format we had. I don't think they've ever used that one motor format except that one race in '93 at Glen Helen. All right, on page 8 and 9, we have an ad for Axo Sports new RX2 Kevlar helmet. As I said previously, I actually never had one of these helmets. I wanted one of the later ones when they had like the exposed carbon fiber look in the late 90s. Kevin Windham ran them and stuff. But early on here, I don't remember any top riders. I think maybe the only guy I saw ever run it in the pros was, I think Jimmy Button ran them in 93. He was an Axo Sport guy racing for Factory Suzuki, and I think he actually ran one of these helmets. But other than that, I don't know that they were super popular. I guess they did well enough that Axo continued to build them. They built helmets at least through the late 90s into the early 2000s. I'm not sure. Like I said, today Axo Sport is mainly an Italian company. There isn't really much of an Axo Sport America per se. Jim Hale sold that part of the company, and if I remember right, about 97. I think Helmet House was the people that ended up with them, and didn't really go as well after that. So anyway, cool helmet for the time. Like I said, I never had one myself though. Alright, on page 10 we have a continuation of the Loretta Lynn's coverage from the previous issue. This one has some photos of Kevin Foley, Kevin Windham, Charlie Bogard, Ricky Carmichael, some of the who's who stars of motocross in the early 90s. Like I said, Loretta Lynn's, I think, started in maybe 82. I'm not sure. I don't remember off the top of my head. So this was already over a decade old at that point. Loretta Lynn's was basically taken over as the premier mini event, even by this point in the early 90s. Other races like Ponca City and some of the other events were still going on, but Loretta's really was the kind of the crown jewel of the amateur circuit, even in the early 90s. On page 11, we have a really cool Pro Circuit ad showing the fact that factory Honda in 93 was using Pro Circuit. In fact, if I remember right, the 500 class was the 500 Hondas were Pro Circuit built. They weren't factory Hondas in the same way that they used to be. I think Pro Circuit did the whole motor package and stuff in 93 for factory Honda. They weren't using like works parts and stuff. That would kind of make sense at this point. This was going to be the last year for the 500 class, and I guess they weren't really interested in putting a whole lot of money into those CR500. It really didn't get much other than a bold new graphics and a few suspension tweaks for the next 8 or 9 years of its life. Pro Circuit always had a big part in Honda's effort, and they also did the 125 motor of, or at least they had a pipe on Jeremy McGrath's bike that year as well. On page 12, we have something called quotables, which is interesting because I actually don't remember this in the other issues. Maybe it's slipping my mind, but this is actually a little piece that's similar to what Racer X does even to this day. They have a very similar section. I'm not sure if it was inspired by this or just coincidental, but this one's talking to Greg Albertine and talking about Greg and how his possible move to the U.S. Greg would stay in Europe in 93 and 94, and then in 95 he would make the move to the U.S., although he wouldn't, at least initially, have nearly the success he had overseas. It would take him a few years to finally get that title. A lot of crashes would follow, unfortunately. At the bottom, we have an article on the fall series that year in 93. They had the idea to have something similar to the old Trans AMAs, give the guys a series to race in the off-season between. It took place at places like High Point, and the picture here is from Englishtown in New Jersey, which coincidentally might be getting a national soon, I think, with Butts Creek going away. But in any case, shows the iconic staircase jump there. I gotta be honest, I don't think the fall series kept going. I don't think it's still going now, although there's lots of regional series, I'm not sure. But in any case, I don't think it really took off majorly in any major way. Starting on page 13, we have a really cool Honda ad for the new CRs. This first page shows all the Supercross titles they had racked up at this point in 93. They would go on to win 3 more with Jeremy McGrath before he switched to Suzuki in 97 and Jeff Emig took the title. This was kind of the end of Honda's dominance, to be honest. After this, they would get Ricky Carmichael to make a switch in 2002 and win a few titles, but really the heyday of Honda is here from the late 80s to the mid 90s. At the time, they were a powerhouse, winning national and supercross titles. In 91, they swept all 3 with Jean-Michel Bayle. They won many in the 125 class. At the time, Honda had some problems with suspension. Their forks weren't great. The shock wasn't great, but they had the best motors in the 125, the 250 class. They were the bike to have as long as you get the forks fixed. Jeremy certainly made them look great on the track, but even the stock bike was a phenomenal machine at the time. And really, after the switch to the aluminum frame, they never really kind of recaptured that dominance in the two-stroke field, at least. When they came out with the four-stroke in 2002, certainly that kind of changed. They came out with much better bikes. Finally got the suspension stuff sorted out, but for a good 10 years, man, Honda was the bike to buy. On page 17, after the CR ad, we have an interesting little tidbit on the first four issues of Inside Motocross. I'm not sure at this point when this was published if the magazine had already announced this would be the last issue, but they did make a commemorative edition, collector's edition of the first four issues. You get with a binder. I was actually really lucky that Jim Hale's son, Michael Hale, sent me a set of the deluxe collector's editions, which are hardbound. And when you look at the price, man, in 1993 this thing cost $100, so it was pretty pricey. It's really cool. It almost seems like something you put in your library. They're really nice. I really appreciated that because I actually had to tear apart all my original issues I had in order to do this. In order to scan these in, I've had to literally shred the magazines and scan them in. It actually takes quite a while. I have to scan each page and is two separate scans and then Photoshop them in together. So they had to give up their life to do this for everybody. So I really appreciate the fact that Michael was nice enough to send me a copy of them so I could still have the set for my collection. Alright, starting on page 18 and running through page 24, we have a really interesting interview with Damon Bradshaw. The interview was done by Fran Kuhn, and he did it a week after Bradshaw announced his retirement at the end of 1993. At the time, Bradshaw was pretty clearly not happy with the way things were going in his career. It's really interesting. He gets into all kinds of stuff. Going back and reading it, it's pretty fascinating. I wasn't aware that he had basically taken up with his girlfriend, now his wife Angela, basically in the interim between the time he hurt his knee at Redbud in '92 and coming back, and that might have had something to do with it. I know Damon says clearly in the interview that he had got to experience a bunch of different things, different aspects of his life that he had not gotten to do while he was, nose to the grindstone racing every weekend, and it had become hard to really get his heart into it when he got back. I think even at the time, some people like Motocross Action probably blamed it on him, having a girlfriend he was real serious about. That's a common thing you hear that, people in general, all of us humans beings get distracted when we first meet somebody we're really into. Might take your eye off of everything else in your life, and that may have had something to do with it. I'm sure that spending time with Angela probably did make it feel like he didn't want to, put everything 100% into motorcycling. Some other things, could seem more important. But Damon talks about, gosh, he even talks about almost being suicidal at one point, which I didn't realize it was quite that dark. And he credits Angela with, possibly not taking a bad turn there when he was really bad. But Damon, he talks about being, pretty not set for life, but pretty well off financially. His contract apparently was for $450,000 per year, which was a lot of money in '93, over 5 years, and he walked away from it after only 1 year, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. But if you're miserable doing your job, and I'm sure at that point he already had a fair amount of money in the bank. He also kind of spent less time with his parents. There were a lot of changes in that 92, 93 time frame that probably caused him to make the decision. He doesn't close the door completely to coming back after a year or so, and as it turns out, he would. He would spend a year and a half kind of away from the sport and then come back at Mount Morris in '95 on the factory Yamaha team again. Wouldn't have the same level of success. He only won one race after his comeback, but in '96 he ended up with I think a second and a third to start the season. And a lot of people thought he would come back to be the same old Damon, but really never really materialized to have the same kind of level of speed. I'm not sure if it was the desire wasn't ever quite there again. He seemed to still take it pretty seriously. Maybe the sport had just kind of moved on. Jeremy definitely raised the bar in that year and a half when he was kind of off. Maybe he lost a little something too. I don't know. Damon though is still one of my favorite riders. I was so bummed when he decided to call it quits in '93. Um, he didn't always have the best attitude. I didn't really. It was pretty clear in '93 that he was miserable. He talks about having the interview on Motor World where he just said no comment, no comment. And it was pretty unpleasant at times, I think, to be around for his team and the people he cared about. But in the end, it was probably for the best that he decided to make a change and step away from the sport for a little while. He's back in the sport now. I think he's working with Gas and is much more involved after several years in the monster truck industry. I think regardless of the fact that he didn't get that '92 title, Damon will always be, one of my favorite riders and one of probably the most popular riders of the '90s. All right, on pages 26 through 43, we have a very lengthy article on the Mammoth Mountain motocross. One of the reasons this issue is probably not my favorite is not every article was particularly interesting to me. I've never been to Mammoth Mountain. Um, the race itself is not like a pro race per se, so it's never really been much of interest to me personally. It is always covered at length in the magazines. Obviously, it's a big race in California, and there are a lot of big names always attend. But myself personally, not really on my radar as anything I'm really that interested in. But this article does have some beautiful photography there. The race is held at a resort in the summer. I think it's a ski resort in the winter, and near Mammoth Lakes, California, as I said. And the race, even in '93, had been going on for 26 years. So there's quite a lengthy history to the event. In '93, this one covers a little bit of some of the new kids coming up, guys like Kevin Windham getting ready to turn pro, and then you have old guys like Johnny O'Mara and Ron Lachine talking about the event coming back. Then you had current pros like Steve Lamson, Ryan Hughes, and some other guys that were racing there. So if I ever had a chance to go to the event, I probably would have a little more interest in it. But other than the beautiful photography, like I said, this particular article never really interested me that much. It is cool to go back and look at the pictures, though, as always. And Fran Kuhn does a great job telling you a little bit about the event. But again, not my most interesting article I ever read in the magazine. All right, after the Mammoth Mountain section, we have a ad for Boyson Reeds. Obviously, in '93, two-strokes were still king. Four-strokes were just an oddity in Europe. You had some Husqvarnas and Husabergs and stuff like that. But for the most part, all the Americans are still riding two-strokes. And Boyson Reeds were one of the most popular, inexpensive mods. They were dual-stage reeds. They also had a product at this time called the Rad Valve as well, which would replace the whole intake. But going back to the '70s, Boyson was a really innovative product at the time when most bikes had reeds that were metal. They were heavy. They came out with a fiber reed that was much more responsive, had a dual stage reed as well. So again, most reeds at the time were a single piece, and by having a lighter section and a larger section, it made the two-stroke a little more responsive, gave it a little snappier power. So Boyson's still around today doing products for two strokes, and I'm sure four strokes. Actually, I think they actually did a pump. They came out with like a little thing that would make your four-stroke, when they were using carburetors, a little more responsive as well. So I think they're still around and still doing good work. All right, on pages 46 through 51, we have an interview with Jeff Emig done by Davey Coombs. At this point in '93, Jeff was coming off a rather up and down year in '93. In '92, he had won the 125 National Motocross title, his first title. In '93, he got to run the #1 plate on his factory Yamaha, but had not been able to back it up. He had lost the title in the end to Doug Henry on his factory Honda. During the season, Jeff had often been the fastest rider, but he had had a real up and down year. He had some problems with mechanical issues and just off races here and there. Neither one of them, Henry or him, really had a perfect season. It wasn't like one was really dominant over the other. It was really back and forth. In fact, with 2 rounds to go, Jeff was still in the points lead, but in the end, Doug would kind of beat him out there. They had some great battles that year. It was definitely a fun season to watch. If you're an Emig fan, though, it didn't really end it the best way for you. In the article, uh, Davey talks a little bit about Jeff, about his family, and at this point, it's like pretty common that kids, when they turn pro, have to kind of move away from their parents. And I didn't realize this, but Jeff apparently had asked his dad not to come to the last round in '92 at Buds where he took the title. He had seen how Mike LaRocco, having his dad so close, had really influenced him and kind of ratcheted up the pressure on Mike, and he kind of wanted to avoid that problem. So it is interesting that that was always a kind of a bone of contention. I think Kawasaki and some of the teams had with Mike, that his dad was so intimately involved, and anytime your dad, your mom, or somebody's involved in something, there's going to be a little bit of a lack of objectivity, I guess, there. And Jeff was trying to avoid that in his own career, and that had to be tough for him and his dad. It also talks a little bit about his relationship with his siblings. His older brother, Brian, was actually faster than Jeff, obviously being 2 years older when they were younger. And when Jeff started to actually pass his brother, they're kind of soured their relationship for a while, but I think they made up for it later in life. But interesting article. Definitely cool to look back on now. And amazingly, Jeff is like a commentator these days on the Supercross broadcast, which, if you see any video of Jeff back in the year this interview was done, is pretty amazing. He had a pretty awful stutter, and it really is inspiring to see that a guy who could barely get out a sentence is now doing TV broadcasts. So good for Jeff, good guy, and awesome interview. All right, starting on page 52, we have coverage of the 1993 Motocross Des Nations from, and I will apologize in ahead of time here, Schwardenstadt, Austria. I'm sure I totally butchered that. I apologize. This is the Motocross Des Nations where America was going for the 13th win in a row. We had won, starting in 1981, every year's event up until this point. In '92, we had sent what was called the B team of Jeff Emig, Billy Lyles, and Mike LaRocco. Going into that race, both Damon Bradshaw, who was out with injury, and Jeff Stanton had bowed out, and that had caused Mike Kudrowski also to bow out, figuring that he wasn't sure who was going to be his teammate that year. I'm not sure what caused them to do that, other than just maybe burnout. I don't know, but in any case, the race went off in Australia, and the quote unquote B team ended up pulling off another victory for the USA. That was a pretty amazing event because at that point, when the race was run, both Jeff Emig and Mike LaRocco were still in the middle of a heated battle for the 125 national title. That year, the event actually went off before the end of the AMA Nationals. For the '93 event, we sent Mike Kudrowski. He went ahead and went this year, and Jeff Emig in the 125s, who had won the previous year, and then in the 250s. Rookie Jeremy McGrath was picked. In the article by Jack Bernicle, it talks a little bit about McGrath's selection. Apparently, and my memory's a little foggy on this one, apparently it was done by popular vote. I'm not sure if we had a mail-in ballot to Motocross Action or how that was done. This year, Roger DeCoster was not involved. He had bowed out the year before, and Roy Jansen had kind of stepped in, if I remember correctly, to lead him and maybe Bevo Forte had been involved in the team. In any case, I don't think Roger was involved in '93 either, so maybe they did something a little different. They actually had a popular vote. Jeremy McGrath, obviously now you hear the name and you think, okay, that's no big deal. Jeremy was a great champion, multi-time Supercross champion, and actually one-time outdoor national champion in '95. Probably should have won in '96 too, if not for an unfortunate crash at Washougal. But in any case, in '93, McGrath was definitely not the most obvious choice. He was not an outdoor guy, quote unquote. He was more of a supercross specialist at that point. He really had not upped his game outdoors. And Jeremy was pretty clearly uncomfortable coming into this event. He had a lot of pressure on him as the rookie, and he talks a little bit about that in the article, saying that it was by far the most nervous he had ever been in a race. There was obviously a lot of pressure on him. Both Kedrowski and Emig were veterans of the event at that point, and a lot of people thought that McGrath would be the weak link. The other problem was the track itself was a very, very traditional European outdoor circuit. There was literally no supercross style obstacles on the track. It was all, you know, fast sweepers, big hills and stuff. None of the stuff that you would think McGrath would have excelled at. So he was really kind of a fish out of water at this event. He would end up getting kind of messed with by Kurt Nicole, and Nicole kind of talks a little trash on him in the article as well. But in the end, you know, we came through. This event was by far one of the closest we had to this point. We barely won it. McGrath in the last moto was taken out in the first turn and then started like in 50th place. You got to figure there's even more guys on the gate. At some of these events, they even ran like a two-tier, you know, second row start because there's so many people in the race. I don't remember if they did that in '93, but there were a lot of guys out there, and both he and Kedrowski had gotten a bad start in the last moto, and it had come down with like a couple laps to go. Kedrowski, who was I think in sixth at that point, needed to make 3 passes in order for America to win. Up front, Kurt Nicole was winning the final moto, but McGrath was buried back in 20th. He came from like 50th to 20th, and Kedrowski had to pass 3 guys, and with a couple laps to go, he put his head down and snagged victory from the jaws of defeat for America in a very spectacular fashion. Kind of similar to what Stanton had done 2 years before on his 500. And as it would turn out, this would be the last of America's win streak. At this point, we had 12 in a row. This would be the 13th win for Team USA. I believe the record holder at that time was Great Britain, who had won, I think, the first 15 events in a row, and ironically not won a single one after that. After '93, America would kind of have a tough run of event finishes here. In '94, we would lose, ironically, to Great Britain, who would win their first motocross destination since that dominating streak at the beginning of the event's running. And then in '95, we'd lose again. In '96, we finally recaptured the crown with Jeff Emig, Steve Lamson, and Jeremy McGrath. In one of the greatest showings probably ever in the event. Our team dominated. Steve Lamson won the 500 class, which I think was the first time that had ever happened. Although in fairness, the 500s by this point were kind of really on the decline. And by '96, Jeremy McGrath was kind of at the height of his powers in the outdoor circuit. He was much more competitive on the motocross circuit. So aside from maybe our win at Budds Creek in '07, '96 ranks right up there with 1986 as one of the greatest showings for Team USA. After '93 here, America would be very hit or miss. We would win, you know, maybe 1 out of 3 or 4 events. Never really had the same level of dominance we had in the '80s. They probably never will again. Motocross certainly has changed a lot since then, and the chances of Team USA dominating on the world stage like that again, probably not great. But who knows? It could always happen again. You never know. All right, on page 65, after the Motocross Does Nation article, we have an ad for Honda of Troy, which was a dealership based out of Troy, Ohio, near the Kenworthy National. Phil Alderton was the man behind this, and in '93 it was pretty much just, I think it was just Eric Kehoe. In '94 he added Todd DeHoop to the team, and then in '95 they really stepped up to the plate. They had a much larger team, and Honda Troy would actually become a pretty powerful competitor to Pro Circuit in the 125 class. Eventually they would switch to Yamahas in, maybe '99 if I remember right. But yeah, Honda Troy was a great team for several years. Guys like Brian Swink, Larry Ward, a lot of the guys who kind of when they lost their factory rides went to Honda Troy. And then, like I said, they would end up winning several 125 Supercross titles as well. So they were a legit team there for a while. On page 66, we start the gallery section, which was one of my favorite, probably my favorite overall section of every issue of Inside Motocross. This one starts out with a awesome photograph of 250 world champion Donnie Schmidt on his Chesterfield Yamaha. The photograph is by Giuseppe Gori, and it shows Donnie trying to defend his number one plate in '93, a title he would eventually lose to Greg Albertine, who had just moved up from the 125 class. Greg had won the 125s in '92, moved up and took the 250 crown away from Donnie that year. Donnie would end up finishing third in the '93 title chase, and then he would end up racing one more year before retiring at the end of the '94 season. In 95, maybe it was 96. At 96, Donnie would end up succumbing to leukemia, really surprisingly. He seemed like a guy, he was only 30 years old at the time, in the prime of his life, and apparently he came down with not feeling well, and within a week or two, I think he was dead. It was really a shock to everybody in the industry, and kind of a sad end to an amazing career. Alright, on the next page we have a couple of shots from the 1993 Millville 500 National. In '93, Millville was the second round of the 500 National title chase, a very abbreviated title chase. At this point, the 500s were only the last 4 rounds. The 250s took over the majority of the events, and then the 125s took place over the entire spread of the event. They basically divided the Nationals into half 250 and half 500. Really not even half, maybe 2/3 250 and 1/3 500. So in a really short series like this, you really couldn't afford any problems. And at Millville, Mike Kudrowski ended up having a stuck throttle in one of the motos. You can see the picture here, Fran shot of it. He's talking to his mechanic Shane Nally about the fact that the throttle was sticking on him, which, as you can imagine, on a KX500, probably not a great thing to have happen. Mike would end up salvaging, I think, 5th overall on this day, but in such a short series, it really handicapped him to the point where he was not able to make up the ground and defend his 500 national title. On the next page, there's a great picture of Mike from, I think it's Unadilla, by Paul Buckley. Mike was much more successful in the 250s outdoor this year. He really dominated that series from start to finish. Really wasn't challenged by anybody. Jeff Stanton was clearly kind of waning at this point. He didn't have nearly the '93 season he had in '92. He challenged Kudrowski on a few occasions, but really Kudrowski was dominant. The only race he even had any problem with was the last round at Glen Helen, when they tried that aforementioned single moto format. He crashed in practice hurt his neck and back, I think, a pretty bad wreck, and LaRocca would end up taking the victory that day. On page 70, we have a really interesting shot of, although you can't tell, it's Stefan Everts, shot by Toshimutsu Sato. Again, apologies on the butchering of your name. This one was shot at the '93 Budds Creek 250 USGP. I was at the event. I live very close to Budds Creek, and I went to all these USGPs. '93 was cool because it was actually the first international event I'd ever attended in person. I had never seen any of the Euros ride. They'd had a few GPs the previous years, but it was always like on the California Glen Helen 500 stuff. I'd never actually been to any kind of Grand Prix race. I was too young when they were at Mid-Ohio in the early 80s and stuff. My parents weren't super into motocross. Actually, they were into motocross not at all. So it wasn't until much later in life that I got to go. So this was a cool event. I remember I got a pit pass this day, and I went back and got to see the cool, GP bikes with their right side up forks on some of them, and just really, really neat exotic stuff you wouldn't see in the American circuit where we have the production rule. This round, if I remember right, Stefan Everts won this, and it was kind of a shock because we expected the Americans to kick butt. I remember watching Jeremy McGrath. I think he got a hole shot in one race, and we all thought, oh my God, he's just gonna wax these dudes, and then he went fading back pretty fast. So it was a wake up call. This was the first time I'd ever seen Greg Albertine race in person. I think he won a moto that day, if I remember right. And I was really opened my eyes as just how fast the Euro guys were. After reading motocross action stuff for years in the 80s and listening to Jody and those dudes, bag on all the Euro guys, I had a preconceived notion that we were just going to, roll over them. But in '93, they came to Budds Creek and they really showed that they were legit dudes and they were to be respected, in spite of all the trash talk that goes on in the magazines. On page 72, we have a really cool shot of Ezra Lusk. This one was taken at the Glen Helen National that year. Like I said, this is the one where they had the single moto format. This circuit, even back in '93, as you can see, had some ridiculously huge jumps on it. This one was a big triple, if I remember right. That race was super hot that day. I remember it was like really hot, and a lot of the guys had some serious trouble with the heat. It was probably a good thing there was a single moto format. On the opposite page, we have a cool photo of Jeff Stanton from the 1993 Steel City National. This was the last 500 national held, unfortunately, because after '93 the class went away. This photo is by Rich Chinette, and it's definitely one of my favorites of this issue of Inside Motocross, and one I always think back to. I love this Axo Sport gear this year. It was some good looking stuff, and that 500 was always a sweet looking machine. On page 74 and 75, we have a pretty interesting photo of Sweden's Peter Johansson and England's Paul Cooper, taken from the '93 USGP. As you can see here, the dirt looks very different than it did in that picture of Stefan Everts earlier. This one shot by Fran Kuhn. This was probably earlier in the day when the track was still pretty wet. Budds Creek is interesting. I've raced there many times, and that sandy Maryland soil, it gets like hard as like concrete when it gets dried up, but then you put a little water on it and it's like a quagmire. It sucks the bike up. So this is probably practice or something, one of the earlier races. There can be some pretty good roost there, but it's when the track is really well prepped, it's an awesome soil to ride on. On page 76 and 77, we have another shot by Fran Kuhn at Budds Creek that year in the USGP. This one's pretty cool. It's by, it's of Todd DeHoop riding on his Honda of Troy CR250R. In the early '90s, they had a thing called Rhino Skins that came out, and they basically turned your bike into a rolling billboard. As you can see, this one, you can really prominently see the Honda Troy on the side. There were several versions of these for different brands. I think a Cherubies made a kit that wasn't quite as all over inclusive as the Rhino Skins. The Rhino Skins kind of replaced all the bodywork. The Cherubies stuff kind of was an insert that went in and covered the engine area. I'm not sure how this would work, especially with modern four-strokes as hot as they run. Probably would not be a great idea. They have a hard time keeping the things from blowing up as it is, so putting full body work on top, probably not a great idea. But it did make a lot of sense as far as marketing goes. You could easily see the Honda Troy sticker a lot easier on that than you could just like a little decal on the shroud. So for whatever reason, they never caught on. I think the only time I ever saw anybody actually running them was in this USGP race. I guess a couple years ago, the Blue Buffalo team tried to do a version of it, although I would say personally it wasn't nearly as attractive as the Rhino Skins. This is something that might come back at some point. I'm not sure. It's kind of one of those interesting things that seems like a great idea, but just has never really caught on. All right, on page 78 and 79, we have a cool photo by Toshimitsu Sato. This one is of the Suzuka round of the 1993 Grand Prix Motocross Series. This one actually has Mike LaRocco going over to Japan to race the regular GP guys on the Japanese soil. A lot of times back in these days, they'd have the Americans would make a trip or two to the GPs, certainly way more than they do now, where pretty much that never happens. LaRocco went out that day and was racing against guys like Alessandro Puzar, Donnie Schmidt, Greg Albertine, the regulars there that day. If I remember right, I think LaRocco actually finished behind Alex Puzar, who won this race. in 93. Here on page 80, we have a photo of a guy you may have heard of by the name of James Stewart by Fran Kuhn. This one was taken at the 93 Loretta Lynn's Amateur Nationals. Stewart obviously would go on to have an illustrious moto career, but even at this point, he was already pegged as a future champion, which is pretty amazing when you consider how young he is here. Stewart would not even turn pro for another 9 years, but people could already see the incredible speed he had even on a PW50. On page 81, we have a photo, another photo from 93. This one is by Fran Kuhn as well. This one's from Unadilla. This year in Unadilla was a disastrous race. There was this was, I think, the first year they had amateur nationals before the event. Prior to this, the track was always pristine. Like when they'd go out there for practice on Saturday, the track would actually have just grass everywhere, which is what you see in the classic photos from the 80s and stuff, where Unadilla was the legendary track that basically had earned its reputation on. By 93, when the Robinson family started actually holding amateur nationals, or amateur days beforehand, the track just got beat. It's not a traditional track, especially back then. It was really a natural terrain type deal, and that sapped all the moisture out of the track that year. And on Sunday for the National, it was a complete dust bowl. I mean, it was the worst dust I've ever seen at a pro motocross event. Several guys had DNFs, top guys too. I think even Doug Henry's bike, I think, went south in one of the motos. But this photo is of John Dowd, who at the time was on a tough racing Kawasaki. He was a privateer that year, and he was holding down second in the moto with a 1 lap to go in the 250 class. And remember, John had won the infamous Sacramento mud bath the year before, but he was just coming on, and he had second in the bag, and his Kawasaki blew up with half a lap to go due to dust being sucked into the motor. And Fran captured that very depressing moment here on film. On pages 82 and 83, we have another photo by Toshimitsu Sato. This one is also taken at the 1993 Japan Grand Prix. This one is of the podium, and it has Alex Puzar, Italian 1990 world champ, throwing his jersey to the crowd. This day he kind of this was his first victory in 93. He had won the world title in 1990 on a Chesterfield Suzuki, but he really didn't have a lot of the same level of success until I think it was 95. He finally backed up his 90 title with another title, this time in the 125 class. Alex was always a fast guy, but I guess 93 was not one of his best years. Alright, starting on page 84, we have our design section, which is always an interesting read in these magazines because they're so of the time. They basically get into some of the technology that was basically making headlines in the industry at the time the magazine was written. This one is obviously from 1993. In 93, there was a kind of a debate still going on as to what was the best type of fork design to use. Basically in 89/90, the industry had made a pretty big jump from conventional forks, which would be the majority of the mechanical components, a larger area on the bottom of the fork, to upside down or inverted forks, which is what you see a picture of here on the main page. The advantages of the inverted design were that it was had less overhang below the axle, meaning it was less likely to get caught in ruts and stuff. And it also was stiffer because the larger diameter section was up at the triple clamps. There was less flex in high G-load situations like whoops and hard landings and stuff. The disadvantages were because that rigidity was built into the design, it also had a little more feedback to your hands. Guys like average Joe Schmo who weren't hitting whoops like Jeremy McGrath, a lot of them felt like they were harsher, especially the earlier designs. The early Shawa stuff that Honda was putting out was pretty terrible. Kayaba had a pretty good handle on it at this point, but the first few Shawa stuff was not great. And in this article it gets into the pros and cons of both designs, why they would go with one versus another. It's a pretty interesting read now when you look back at it. On the next page you have a No Fear ad from 93 here, and at the time No Fear again was not a gear company. They were selling basically stickers and casual wear stuff. The photo, I think, is of Mike Kudrowski's rear wheel. It's kind of hard to tell, and it's talking about luck would have run out by now. They're making a reference to America winning its 13th motocross destinations in a row. On page 86, we have a look at basically the state of the art in fork design at the time, which was Showa's new twin chamber fork, which was making its debut on the 94 Suzuki's. The twin chamber basically had a sealed oil cartridge system inside it to prevent cavitation, which is like air bubbles, to prevent that from, like, the oil from frothing and give you more consistent damping control. This was really the first kind of salvo that Showa made back towards KOIB's dominance in the upside down fork design. In the text part of it, they also talk a little bit about the marketing end of the switch to USDs, that it wasn't just about the fact that they would work better on the track. A lot of it was marketing spin. There was a pressure, obviously, always is, to make the bikes look new, make them look innovative, make them look interesting. And the manufacturers, very similar to what they did with air forks, they always feel the pressure to come up with something new. New isn't always better. The original USD upside down fork stuff had come out in the early 80s. There were a couple of kids. Brad Lackey had used a set of them on his Works RM in 82, if I remember right. So they were out there initially, and like I said, Honda had been dabbling with them since the mid 80s. So it wasn't like it was completely new technology, but the jury was still seriously out in 93 as to whether or not that was the right direction to go. On the next page, we have an ad for Bad Betty Squadron, which I only vaguely remember, Doug Henry having a sticker on his helmet or something for. I got to be honest, I had never had anything from the Bad Betty Squadron. I have no idea if they are still around. I would highly doubt it. Maybe some of you guys will remember it. I have no idea what exactly they sold. It shows that they sell jackets, sweaters, hats, and tees, but Lord knows where they are now. On the last page of our design section, we have a look at, there's a nice picture of Marzocchi's Magnum 45 conventional forks, which were available at this time. After the switch to inverted designs, there was kind of a little bit of a pushback towards conventional forks. You had Marzocchi with these, and they actually, version of this came on KTM's at some point in the mid 90s, if I remember right. Suzuki also made a switch back to conventional forks in 96. Showa had a set of them that featured a very little fork over or underhang below the axle, so that basically got rid of that complaint of the conventional designs. And I had a 96 250 N125 that year RM, and it was some of the best suspension I've ever had, and I've had over 50 bikes in my life. Those forks were awesome for me. And again, I'm like a middling B rider, so at the pro level, guys like Mike LaRocco and Jeremy McGrath didn't care for them. Even the larger conventional designs like what was used on the KTM's and on the Suzuki's still had a great deal more forks flex. I mean, there's no way I'm hitting a set of whoops at fourth gear like these guys are. And they ended up putting braces on their forks and eventually going back. I think Jeremy McGrath's presence at Factory Suzuki in 97 was one of the main reasons that the conventional forks went away for good. There were many market factors. I think, reading at the time, Suzuki as well wasn't getting any help. None of the other manufacturers wanted to make the move back. They fought it very much like they fought the switch back to spring forks now, which is happening from air forks. The manufacturers had invested a lot of money in the inverted design, didn't really want to see it go away, even though I think for the average guy, the conventionals worked better. But in any case, that's kind of settled now. Everybody's gone to inverted designs, and the conventional forks days are over for good, I think. On the next page, you have a ad for Rinthal. Rinthal was another company that was being marketed by Jim Hale in the early 90s. He helped bring Rinthal to prominence here in the U.S., along with his sponsorship of Factory Honda. And the fact that you had Jeremy McGrath running your sprockets and grips and bars certainly didn't hurt. I'll be honest, a lot of the reason I ran Rinthal was because they look cool and they were on the Factory Honda team. So marketing does matter. And I think it was a big reason they became such a powerhouse in the early 90s. All right, on pages 90 and 91, we have an article by Jack Bernicle on the resurrection of the four strokes in Europe. The 500 class in the early 90s was going away in the U.S., but still continued in Europe. But in Europe, it was seeing an interesting shift away from the 500 two-strokes, which were not enjoying any more developed by the Japanese. The Japanese pretty much had lost interest in the class. Many of them in the mid early 80s. Suzuki had stopped making an RM500 in the US in 84 was the last year. And then Yamaha had kept making the YZ490, but it was clear that they didn't have any interest in updating it. By most accounts, the last real update was in 89 and 88 when Kawasaki redid their 500 and then Honda in 89 redid theirs. That's basically the last major update the 500s would see in the two-stroke realm. So companies like Husqvarna, which was at this point an Italian company, and the people who were the original Husqvarna, when it was Swedish, became Husaberg. They were really getting into developing the four-strokes for racing. And in Europe, it was kind of catching hold. Here in the U.S., it was still odd to see a guy on a four-stroke. You might see some dude with like an ATK or an ATK framed XR600, but that was about all you'd see at the local level. And in the nationals, it was really, I think the only guy I ever saw riding one was, I think Todd DeHoop rode a Husaberg maybe in 92 or 93, when those were really rare and kind of exotic. But in any case, in Europe in 93, Jackie Martins took a Works Husqvarna four-stroke to the 500 world title, which was the first time anybody had done that since 1965. So it was kind of like going full circle. Once upon a time, four-strokes were the motorcycle in motocross. In the early days, in the starting for scrambles in the 20s, they were riding four-strokes, essentially street bikes with lights taken off. It wasn't until the mid 60s that companies like Husqvarna and CZ and stuff kind of switched the market to two strokes, which were lighter, not as torquey, but they basically had a huge advantage in terms of weight and handling because of the weight was so much lighter. In the early 90s, you saw pioneers like Husqvarna moving that back. Like I said, there were bikes like ATKs and stuff, but again, they were niche bikes. They weren't really major market stuff. By the time that the Yamaha YZ400 came out in '98, people were becoming a little more accepting of four strokes. And then, of course, obviously, after the YZF came out, that really took four strokes mainstream again. And then now, today, obviously, that's all anybody rides. All right, on page 93, we have a breakdown of the contributors to this issue of Inside Motocross. And again, it's pretty high-profile names, guys like Paul Buckley, Davey Coombs, Jack Bernicle. These are guys that were doing a lot of writing in the 90s for several publications and also photographs, obviously in the case of Buckley. You also have a shout out to Naoki Shibata, which was one of the Japanese photographers that was really putting out a lot of good photos in the early 90s. And then some other people like Carl Ockert, Pierre Gauthier, some other people that contributed to helping making this issue what it is. Alright, here on page 94 95, we have the photograph that I most remember this issue for. It's a photo of Damon Bradshaw on his YZ125 by Carl Ockert. It's a testament to how bad this season goes that I do not remember a single instance where Damon Bradshaw was on a YZ125. He was miserable all this year, and I think his finishes were pretty miserable on the YZ. And this is basically a little quote from him saying that, at the point where it's no longer any fun, he said he'd quit, and he made good on his word. This was the end of really his run here at Steel City, the last race he raced before hanging up his boots. Like I said earlier, he did come back a year and a half later, but honestly, this is the end of the first iteration of Damon Bradshaw. And I'm glad that he did come back. It was cool to see him come back. I was so psyched for him, but he just really wasn't the same guy after that. Alright, we reached the end of the fourth and final issue of Inside Motocross. This one ends with an ad for Access Sports RC2 Kevlar boot. I actually have the pair that's in the dead middle there, the white with the pink and the blue. Love those boots. They were great boots. As you can see, they won many customer choice awards for motocross action, which was kind of like the Bible for motocross at the time in America, at least. Um, I hope you enjoyed this. This one putting these magazines together has taken me about 2.5 months of work. I had to kind of shred my magazines to do it, and then scan them in, Photoshop all the stuff together so it showed as a layout here for everybody. Um, I thought it was important because Inside Motocross really is a key part of the heritage of motocross in America. It was an iconic magazine that really shaped the way the motocross industry and magazines looked for the next 20 or 30 years. It's made certainly a lasting impact, and like I said, you see its inspirations in magazines like Meta Today and the defunct Motocross Journal, RacerX. Um, Jim Hale, he recently passed, and that was definitely a terrible thing. And but it's cool that his legacy will live on. And I thought it was important to put one of the things that I love the most about his time in motocross, Inside Motocross, out there for the world to be able to read it. I was lucky enough to still have copies myself, but I know a lot of people were either too young or never had them in the first place to have read them. And you can really see the beauty and the craftsmanship and the love that went into making this magazine. And I think the fact that people still love it to this day is a testament to how great the work of guys like Jim Hale and Fran Kuhn and Davey Coombs and Jack Bernicle and Paul Buckley, all the people that helped make the magazine so great. So again, if you enjoyed this, make sure you check out the others. I did do issues 1 through 4 as well. I'm sorry, 1 through 3 as well. And I did kind of a play-by-play on each issue. And there's also, if you go to my website again, which is the Motocross Vault wordpress.com. I'm also posting full PDFs of every issue as well, so you can download them and read them at your leisure. And I certainly hope everybody enjoys it. And God bless and peace.